Thank you. Yeah. So I'm Father Will Banowsky. I'm currently the parochial vicar at St. Charles Borromeo. I am the chaplain at Bishop McGinnis Catholic High School, and I'm an associate judge for the Archdiocesan Tribunal. So please pray for vocation so I can have less work. Um, so, you know, I'll try and be brief when I end up talking about myself, which is one of my favorite topics of interest to discuss. I can be a little bit long-winded. Honestly, growing up, the priesthood really wasn't on my radar for most of my life. It's kind of, as a little kid, I grew up in a very Catholic household. I'm the oldest of four. And growing up, it's like, okay, well, I want to be an astronaut, but then I saw Apollo 13, and I did not want to be an astronaut after that. I wanted to be Indiana Jones, but eventually I kind of got in my head, by the time I was 18, when I planned out my perfect life, I was going to go to OU for undergrad. Then I was going to move back to Dallas, where I grew up, and I was going to go to Southern Methodist for law school. And I was going to be married by 25. I was going to move into my old neighborhood down the street from my parents, and it was going to be perfect. And really, the first time I'd ever said that I was going to become a priest, I was 18 years old, and I was talking to my high school girlfriend. It was one of those sort of things where it's like, where I said, oh, if we ever break up, I'm going to become a priest. And I wasn't being serious about it. Obviously, it came true. But it was one of those things where just like, oh, you're so wonderful that the only thing that I can replace the void of you with is the priesthood kind of thing, And that was sort of, that was the first time I'd ever mentioned becoming a priest and had no seriousness of it all. Of course, I always knew, that every Catholic man should discern both marriage and the priestly life up until the point where that window is closed. Obviously, once you're married, that window is closed. When you enter seminary, you probably should not be having girlfriends on the side. No, you definitely should not be having girlfriends on the side. And when I got to college, growing up, I was very active in my faith. My family, we all volunteered at RE at our parish. I was active in youth group, had gone on a couple of Catholic Heart work camps. I was really engaged with my faith. And when I got to college, kind of where really started to own it, on my own. And it was beneficial that St. Thomas More just happens to be across the street from the dorms. Like, it makes it very convenient when you're a college student and the last thing you want to do on Sunday is get up and go to Mass, that you can just walk, especially when you don't have a car. And I met a couple guys there my freshman year who were talking about how they were discerning the priesthood. And it started making me think about it, in a way that was a little bit more serious than just telling, your high school girlfriend, if we break up, I'm going to become a priest, because you're just that wonderful. And I remember going on a mission trip to Arteaga, Mexico, with the group. I was in this chapel. It was very much weighing on my mind because I had been told since I was like 15, oh, you're going to be a great dad. You're going to be a great dad. Which eventually I came to the realization that the skills that make you a good father are the skills that make you a good father. And I was praying in this chapel, and I was looking up at the statue of Christ. I was like, all right, what is it? What do you want from me? What am I supposed to do? Of course, I had no idea what the application to seminary process even was. And I definitely was not mature enough at 18 to even think about that. I always am kind of bit sort of amazed at those guys who go to college seminary, because I remember 18-year-old me, and he only had he cared about God, but his top three interests were girls, video games, and OU football, and not necessarily in that order. So I was praying in this chapel, and it's like, what is the call you want from me? I remember walking out of there with a lot of peace and this feeling, in my heart that I was called to hand on the faith to the next generation. And the way I interpreted then I believe that is still accurate, but I believe that God gave me the freedom I needed to really experience my life in such a way that I could have more freedom when it finally came time to realize my call. And so I walked out of there with the thoughts like, all right, well, I'll get married, I'll teach RE, I'll hand on the faith of my children, let's go. And so this was sort of how I kind of interpreted my vocation going forward. And to the point where my sophomore year of college, Archbishop Beltran, who was the Archbishop at the time, he came down to say Mass for the college students at the beginning of the school year, and I was helping him bring his mitre and crozier in from the car, and he looked at me like he's looked at a lot of young men, and he said, have you ever thought about becoming a priest? And, I looked at Archbishop Beltran, and with a straight face, I said, yes, but I've already ruled it out. And I think somewhere God laughed, And really for most of my time in college, I really didn't think about the priesthood. I dated with the intention of discerning marriage, and two very wonderful women. In fact, it's really funny that my college girlfriend, we dated for about 2.5 years. And I remember right about the start of my senior year of college, I was at Mass with my family before having to go back to school. And my brother looks at me and goes, Will? And I'm like, yeah, you're the closest one of us to getting married, but you're the closest one of us to becoming a priest. I'm like, I don't know how that works, but, And then, we broke up, and I started dating this other young woman who I was utterly convinced that was the love of my life, Obviously, she was not. But kind of had this thought process and this journey. And when that relationship ended, it ended in a very sort of tragic and kind of dramatic way. That there's probably a screenplay in there for Lifetime Channel or something, and I'll spare the details because it's really not that important to the overall scheme of my vocation. Well, it is, but privacy's sake. And I remember talking to my dad, just kind of going through that healing process, and I was at a Night of Columbus meeting. It was for April. And they said, oh, well, the World Day for Prayer for Vocations this year is April 25th. And I was like, oh, that's the day before my birthday. And that kind of stuck with me. So I started talking to my dad about it. It's like, I had these thoughts back when I was, 18, and I've kind of shown them away, and now they're kind of coming back. And that's when, my dad and we had a long conversation about it. It's like, well, son, you could be a father of 4 children like I am, or you could be a father of thousands. And it's like, of course, my dad was always the one who I'd be at the dinner table. It's like, I would really love it if one of my sons became a priest. And I was always the smart aleck that would go back, well, what about one of your grandsons? And he would look at me and he would point and say, no, son. And of course, that wasn't the right time to discern, going through all that. And it wasn't until about the end. So after undergrad, I went to law school because that was the plan, right? Except I'd already deviated from the plan because I liked OU so much, and I liked Norman so much, and I liked living in Oklahoma so much that I stayed at OU for law school. In fact, our Chancellor, Michael Scaparlanda, was one of my professors. And so I'd already deviated from the plan, but I was still in law school, so the plan was still kind of alive. And I got to my last year, and I'd realized, I don't really want to be a lawyer anymore, but I'm here, so I might as well finish. Because, I was in my, starting my last year. I had 2 semesters to go. It's like, I might as well just see this through. And I got to my last semester, and that's when I really started thinking about things more earnestly. And of course, it also helped that when our new pastor had arrived that summer, Father Jim Goins, who's the current pastor of St. Thomas More, we were at a graduate student gathering, and the first thing he said to me after I introduced myself, I'm Will Banowsky, I'm about to go in my third year at law school at OU was, have you ever thought about becoming a priest? So it was the second time someone had said that to me, and this time I didn't laugh it off dismissively. And so that kind of stuck, and and I was like, well, you're trying to figure out my plan. And so my backup plan from not being a lawyer was I wanted to go into university administration. I thought, well, that seems fulfilling. And I really like the university setting, and I really like what it stands for, and I know how good it can be for the lives of a lot of people. And so I was told that the best way to get into university administration is through working in fundraising. I was like, okay, well, I will find any fundraising job that I can, And so I had sent off my resume to Catholic Charities because I heard that they were looking for some development position, and they called me. Tim O'Connor, the former executive director, asked if I would come and do an interview. And I remember in my interview, they asked me, I think it was actually Nancy Largent asked me, why do you want to work for a nonprofit when you can make a lot more money in the private sector? And my response was, I want to keep my soul. It's one of those, sometimes my mouth engages before my brain. And so I was hired as the director of development for Catholic Charities. It was my first real job, and I had no idea what I was doing, and somehow I made it work. But it was one of those things where if you are discerning a vocation and you don't want to think about discernment, then don't work for the church. Because if you are discerning a vocation and you are working for the church, you're constantly reminded of it every day. And through working Catholic Charities, I got to meet a lot of the priests. In fact, the first time I met Father Novak, who was the vocation director at the time, I had driven over to St. John Nepomuc in Yukon, where he's pastor, with Tim O'Connor to talk about the Catholic Charities annual appeal. And I was introduced, and Father Novak said, because Father Novak, when he was in seminary, took some time away and worked in communications at Catholic Charities, and he said to me, that office has a tendency to lead to the priesthood, right? So, well, we'll see, I said. But the more I got to meet the priests of the diocese, the more I got to know Archbishop Coakley, it just was not going away. This sentiment, and really learning more about my faith, learning more about who priests are. Because growing up, our pastor was an old Monsignor, and that's all I saw. I was like, oh, Monsignor Johnson, he's just old, But as you got, there's that distance there. But the more I got to meet priests and realize that they're real people, the more attractive the priesthood sort of became, to the point where I couldn't really get the thoughts out of my head. And so finally, it was January of 2012. I'd been at Catholic Charities for about 4 or 5 months. And I was like, okay, I need to talk to Father Novak. I just need some more information. So I called him, I set up a meeting, and thinking I was just a little informational session. And I get there, and it turns out that it's the initial interview. I was not planning that, And so it's like, so we go through everything. And I'm like, oh, okay, And so it's like, all right, well, let's just run with this. And so I started the process, met with Archbishop Coakley, I'd done my psychological evaluation, but I never actually started writing anything on the application. I just kind of was on a PDF file in my computer. I hadn't touched it because everything was feeling like it was moving way too fast for me. It's like I had been thinking about it, but I just wanted an information session. And then Father Novak said, yeah, if you get your application in by the end of February, you can be accepted by mid-March. I'm like, what? I just called you in January. And right around that time, Tim O'Connor, our executive director, had mentioned that he was going to retire. And so pretty much at that time, the totality of the development knowledge for the agency was resting in a few people, one of which was Tim O'Connor, and one of which was me. And if we both were to leave at the same time, and so all of a sudden it's just like, well, this is my excuse not to go, And so in mid-March, rather than turning in my completed application, I put it on hold. So I just don't know. And that started off a long period of really what I call the running away times. Because the longer I went without completing that application process, the more and more anxious I felt, the more and more just sort of like something was missing, the more unfulfilled I felt. And at first I thought it was just the stress related to fundraising, but it was a little bit more than that. And I think when you spend your time at work, when you have free moments, Googling fundraising jobs in Hawaii, it's probably a sign that you need to kind of reassess and reevaluate. And I was kind of struggling, and then I got to August of 2012, and I was dropping off Catholic Charities appeal materials at the cathedral, and I just knew, it's like, I have to go to seminary. I have to go to seminary. So I contacted the vocations office, and Father Hamilton was the vocation director at the time. There was kind of a changeover. And so went in, redid the initial interview process. And then I didn't have to re-meet with Archbishop Coakley at that point. At that point, I had written things that he had signed his name to, so we knew each other decently well. It's one of those things, my first task at Catholic Charities when I was hired, like that first week was, you need to write the letter that the Archbishop is going to sign that we send out with the appeal. And I'm just like, I'm just now forgetting how to write like a lawyer. How the heck do I write like a bishop? And I hope to never, ever, ever have to do that ever again. And so I did. They did want me to redo my psych eval, and so I did that. That's how I know I'm psychologically okay, because I've done it 3 times. So I had to do it again to go to the North American College. And I, right around that time, I was asking my friends and people that cared about me to pray for me, and I made a mistake in the sense that it wasn't really a mistake, but I one of the people that I texted to ask to pray for me was the mother of the girl that I thought I was going to marry. And she said, well, before you go, I'd love for you to meet my cousin's daughter. I think you guys would hit it off, and we would love for you to marry into the family. I'm like, okay, well, this is weird. But I knew that she thought I was like the greatest guy ever. So, it was okay. And there's a little bit of ego and pride thing involved there. And that kind of, I was like, oh, I'm just not going to ignore it. And then I was doing United Wayfarers at the, October, November is United Way campaign season. So oftentimes the partner agencies will go to different businesses to kind of give a spiel about the agency in hopes to convince them to donate to us. And so I was very quick on volunteering for those. So there's one day where I just volunteered, and they also appreciated that I was quick to volunteer, so we got some of the good ones. So I had volunteered to go out and be at Tinker speaking basically from 5 a.m. was when they would pick me up to take me to the base until 5 p.m. And so being at Tinker for about 12 hours, I was just really bored. And boredom is when we get in trouble. So I did reach out to this young woman, and we were talking, And at this point, my dad, who I knew my vocation well before I ever did, he sends me, we're talking, it's like, I don't know, Dad. It's like, son, you need a waffle. And he goes, son, you need a spiritual director. And I said, okay. And then he sends me a 4-page email, which I wish I would have saved and I didn't. Basically explaining about all the sort of spiritual bumps in the roads that could happen and why I need a spiritual director and all these wonderful supportive things. So I contacted Father Shane Tharp, who I had met through working in Catholic Charities, who was about as big of a nerd as I was, and asked if he would be my spiritual director. And that for me was just very important. One, the importance of having a spiritual director in every facet of your life in discernment, but it was the first time where I truly saw myself represented in a priest. There are a lot of priests who share my sports interests, but this was one that shared my interest in comic books and video games and in science fiction and all these things. And that was very important. And we would meet for spiritual direction and for about an hour and a half, because the first 30 minutes we were catching up on comic books. And it was just absolutely beneficial for my spiritual life and my journey. But I was still kind of struggling. I was still feeling very anxious and depressed at work. And I was still waffling, because I felt like if I were to flip a coin up in the air and said, heads, I'm called to be a priest, tails, I'm called to the married life, that every time I would flip this hypothetical coin, it would land, vertical, and which was of no help. And I had a lot of fears that were wrapped up into it, because I had a good job, even if there were some days where the stress was too much. I had a really good living situation. I was living in a house that my parents owned in Norman. So even though I was paying utilities, but I didn't have to pay for rent, because my parents said we could live under their roof for free until we got married, but they didn't specify which one. And I had a dog, and I was like, well, what do I do with a dog if I go to seminary? I can't take a dog to seminary. But all these stupid things that I was using as excuses, fears to kind of go in, to not go in. And I remember it very vividly. It wasn't ordination, it was the Chrism Mass. It was the Chrism Mass of 2013. And I remember that day very vividly, because I was just, kind of wondering if I needed just to step away because I was just not happy at work. There were a lot of good things I was doing, but I just did not feel like that I was where I was supposed to be. And one of the hard things about your first job is when you have to be somebody's boss, and when that person is the same age as you and is in your peer group, it makes it, you've never been someone's boss before. So I had an administrative assistant that I don't think I was necessarily the supervisor that she needed to really grow professionally, because I barely knew who I was professionally. And I remember being called into Nancy Largent's office that morning, because Nancy, who was my supervisor at the time, was just very wise and very insightful. And she, and of course, everyone knew was considering the priesthood, because I started my application and stopped it twice at this point. And I remember, Nancy was told me afterwards, I kind of threw you under the bus in there a little bit, but it was because I knew that your administrative assistant would respond better if she knew that she wasn't, that she had someone with her that was also kind of being thrown under the bus as well. And I remember Nancy just saying in that meeting, and it just stuck with me, at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, is this where I want to be? And I had been just thinking about that all day. It was just stuck in my head all day. And I couldn't shake it. And so that afternoon, Nancy and I went over to the Chrism Mass, because we always like to have some sort of Catholic charity presence at the large diocesan ministries or liturgies, and we were sitting together. And I just remember, so the Chrism Mass is beautiful, not because that's where the priests renew their promises. It's just a wonderful part of that Mass. And I just remember seeing all the seminarians who were home for Holy Week process in, all the priests were there for process in, and there was that moment of clarity that the fears that I was having, the fears that I was going through, were not just unique to me. That every single one of those seminarians that processed in had dealt with those fears or had entertained those fears. Every single one of those priests who were processing in had entertained those fears, had to manage those fears and face them, going all the way back to the original 12. I mean, do I leave my job is not unique to then Will Banowsky in 2013 at Catholic Charities. I mean, James and John, Peter and Andrew left their nets behind, Matthew left his job as a tax collector. And at that moment, there was just that moment of clarity that I was not going to be alone. That whatever I did by going through, if I went to seminary, because I got to the point where it's like, I'm never going to know what my vocation is unless I go to seminary. But my fears related were with going to seminary at that point because, what if? Like, what if I go to seminary and after a month, I realize it's not for me? Well, I've just quit my job, I've just moved out of my house, then what? But I was like, I need to trust. And so I kind of spent that week just kind of reflecting on that. And on Good Friday, I woke up that morning and I just had that moment of clarity and I knew. And so I called my dad. And of course, my dad, who was the most supportive of me the whole time, of course, he was also going through the inquiry process for the permanent diaconate in the Diocese of Dallas right around the same time, where his pastor had sort of mentioned to the bishop at the time as someone who would be a good candidate. So we'd kind of talked about these things. And I remember telling him on this phone conversation, it's time for me to stop listening to my head and start listening to my heart. And I just remember that just smart aleck comment from my dad's like, well, I could have told you that, son. I was like, well, why didn't you? And so I go into work on Easter Monday and I knock on Nancy's door. I said, do you have a moment? So I closed the door and I said, I just wanted to let you know, because you are the director of HR and my supervisor, that I'm going to apply to seminary. And if I get in, then I'm going to go. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, I figured we were going to have this conversation. And it goes back to what Molly was saying. Like there was a visible change on my face at that Mass. And so I ended up actually opening the application. I'd started in January of 2012 with talking with Father Novak and being given the application. And it wasn't until April of 2013 where I actually opened the document and actually started working on it and got everything in order. And I went to go turn it in. And I remember my dad calling me and said, have you turned the application yet? And I said, no, I'm going to do that. I'm on my way to go do it. So he goes, well, when you get to the pastoral center, let me know so I can put my application of the diaconate in the mail at the same time as you hand in yours so we can start this together, which was really wonderful that we kind of shared that because when he started formation in earnest was my first year of seminary. When he was ordained a permanent deacon June 2nd of 2018. I was ordained a transitional deacon September 27th of 2018, so he was able to vest me as a deacon because he beat me to the diaconate by like 3 months. Of course, the day I turned in my application, my brake pad in my car fell out on I-35 in rush hour traffic on my drive from Norman to Oklahoma City. And so when I went to put my car in the shop to get the brake pad fixed, my bill to have everything fixed was $666 and some change. And I was like, well, this isn't a sign that somebody didn't want me to make it to the pastoral center today. I don't know what is. Because once I finally got into seminary, then there really weren't those doubts. Those doubts were just what I needed. It's really interesting too. I don't know how familiar you are with the Myers-Briggs, but they say that you can kind of recess a little bit when you are kind of down or depressed. So I had done it for a leadership training in which it told me that I was an INFP, which I thought was very odd because I didn't consider myself an introvert. We did it again in seminary as part of our human formation, and it had flipped back to E. And so that was assigned to me. It's like, I'm in the right spot. So once I got there, I didn't really have the same doubts. Of course, my doubts my initial year of seminary were the fact that I wasn't having the doubts that my classmates were having. It's like, am I doing this wrong? They're all having this doubts and I'm not. But I think a lot of it is because God gave me the freedom and gave me enough space to really discern my life, to really look at what my goals are and had set so that I could get to the point where I realize what it was without going into seminary with those regrets. It's like, oh, well, I'm in seminary, but what I thought I would be a lawyer. Well, what that life would have been like? Well, now I know what that life would have been like, and I'm a lot more happier now. And it's the same thing with, I needed to get in my own time that realization that the skills that make you a great father are the skills that make you a great father. And, that reality of, knowing that I did discern marriage. And I know more clearly that this was my vocation. And, I'm not necessarily, some people say I'm a later vocation. I don't think entering in at 27 makes you a later vocation. Some people do. But I know that I needed that time to gain that maturity. There are a lot of young men I know that had that maturity and that knowledge at 18. At 18, I would probably have been discerned out, and I needed to gain that maturity. And so I often tell people, you don't have to figure out your life at 18. You don't have to figure your life out at 22. You should have it figured out by 30. But you do need to keep God involved in the process. And I think for me, being able to work at Catholic Charities, being able to work at a place where the Blessed Sacrament was downstairs from my office, being able to work for the church, and really learn more about my faith and what it really means to me to get to know those priests, to know I was called to work for the church, but I needed to get a different job in the church. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Father. We probably don't have time for questions, but we do have time for your blessing.
All right. The Lord be with you. And Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Go in peace.